I'm Laura Hall. I'm a game designer, artist, and writer. I live in Portland, Oregon. And I make a lot of stuff. Right now my focus is escape rooms, but I'm also really involved in like alternate reality games and art installation work. These are some of the things that I've worked on recently. The Amazon Echo Escape at New York Comic Con. There was a national tour of a Resident Evil game that I helped work on. The Silence in Room 1258 was an installation piece in London in 2017. And the piece that we'll be discussing today mostly is Spark of Resistance, which was the first ever escape room game that I made. That one, it was in Portland. It doesn't exist anymore, but that was a spy drama set in an alternate universe, kind of Cold War era dystopia. And today I'm going to talk about the design principles of how I make deeply narrative and immersive escape rooms, in particular the lessons I've learned and the mistakes that I've made to learn those lessons, and why those games work best when all of the work that goes into them is totally invisible to the player. But to kick it off, I want to define some stuff first. And can I ask, how many people have actually been to an escape room? Yes, that's great. That makes my job a lot easier. So like a quick overview, they started out as these point-and-click flash games in the early double aughts. Someone pretty quickly had the idea to translate those into actual physical spaces. But the earliest you're seeing those is around that time. So this is actually still a pretty new genre, even though it draws from things that have existed for hundreds of years. When I'm talking about escape rooms, then, I'm referring to the specific physical space. People buy tickets to visit it. They may or may not be locked in. It's usually like against fire code these days to actually lock the door, so that's fine. There's generally an hour to play the puzzle. Sometimes it can be as little as 45 minutes, sometimes up to 90. And often you're not actually trying to escape anymore. They're usually goal-oriented. But as an example, more often than not, it's defusing a bomb. But it's a relatively new genre. And it's part of what we refer to as immersive entertainment. So some definitions of that. No Proscenium, which is an amazing resource for this kind of thing, puts it as an experience that physically and usually narratively places the audience in the same space where the action is occurring. And Sarah Thatcher, who works at Disney and is amazing, she defined it as something without a frame around it. There's no proscenium, no screen. It's something that's happening in space. That also encompasses things like theater, haunted houses, theme parks, live action role play, installation work. They draw upon a lot of principles that have crossover in user experience and video game level design. And so while this presentation specifically deals with escape rooms, there are lots of design principles that I think are, and I wish were, universally applicable. These are some of the dimensions of immersion that you get either in a physical space or in interacting with a screen. So you're enjoying your time there, hopefully. You're mentally engaged in the process. You're feeling a sense of spatial presence, whether that's in relation to a game controller or the environment around you. And the ultimate goal is to feel transportation, so you're immersed in a narrative. To me, that feeling of transportation is key to all of the work that we do. And then this is a basic spectrum of where immersive works tend to fall. It's developed by Rachel Pendergrass. So is there a cohesive story, or is the experience largely about setting a mood? Would the performance work if there was no audience participating, or is it entirely reliant upon participation? There's other questions about people's ability to move through the space, or whether they're stationary, whether or not there is a fourth wall, or they're able to engage directly with the actors, for example, or whether the narrative is set and it can be influenced by the people doing those interactions. And you can see that escape rooms fall upon the audience-dependent line and the atmospheric line. So lots of theming, and it can't take place without the people in it. And then also, I'm going to break down some of the elements of our game, and there may be other ways that you personally define these, but when I'm speaking about it, this is what I mean. The narrative is the story told by the world. The set, the objects, everything is speaking to whatever the story is that you're inhabiting, versus the story or the plot, and that's the action that's playing out over the hour that people are inside the game. And then there's another layer, which is the game flow. That's the puzzles and interactions that people are progressing through that is driving them forward. So when we set out to design these, we're facing 3 challenges. We want to tell a story that's entertaining while people are under a significant physical and mental stress. We want to tell that story in a physical space in a cinematic way. And we want to use puzzles and interactions thoughtfully to make it fun and reinforce the themes of whatever they're going through. And so again, I want to draw your attention to the place where escape rooms fall on here, because it is different to what my goals are. My goal is to drive it fully into the narrative side. I have never seen an escape room reviewed like a theater performance before, and so that is what I'm working toward. I want it to be taken seriously as art. But because it is still emerging, there are people who are trying to do that, but generally not so much with the story stuff. So, our first challenge, telling the story while people are under significant physical and mental stress. When we think about these designs, our first step is narrowing in on what's happening to people's brains in these spaces, and cognitively there's a lot going on. And this is really easy to see when people step inside a theater or a haunted house. They both have visitors crossing a threshold into another world. The lights go down, the music starts, people's hearts speed up a little. Their eyes are like adjusting to the light, and they start darting around, and they're keying into what's happening. But that's actually the brain entering a kind of survival mode. And once that switch has been flipped, we're then asking people to solve puzzles or take in information or interact with characters. And it's a real challenge to communicate directly with the player's brain when it's in that state. So I'd like to talk for a minute about what is happening to players mentally when they're in that escape room. They're in survival mode. They're excited. We've used lighting cues and design to bring them into a flow state. And so I want to show you a video. It's really important that you follow the instructions on the screen very carefully.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Go!
So that's more generally known as the invisible gorilla experiment. It's a great example of how the brain and the body are doing weird things in concert when they're in stressful situations and when you're asking people to focus on particular things. And you see that play out in escape rooms all the time. In our original room, we had a klaxon that blared anytime we were delivering a hint to people, and people would be standing right next to it. And this is a loud klaxon, and they would totally miss it because they were so deeply engrossed in whatever they were interacting with. And that's something that we just have to keep in mind for basically every single part of the story that we're trying to convey. Another funny kind of lizard brain survival mode thing is that we love to look for patterns in stuff. Like, does this sink look worried to you? In an escape room, you can see how that becomes a problem if you need people to find only the specific patterns that you want them to find. So this is what's happening in people's brains. They're deeply focused to the exclusion of most other information. They're quickly searching and processing to try and make connections between the game elements. And they're getting mentally and physically exhausted by what they're seeing and doing. Ignoring the physical element is something that you also see a lot, but people become so wrapped up in these games that they forget that they're standing on a hard, cold concrete floor for an hour. And afterward, they're like, why do my legs hurt so much? Well, we know why. So the lessons for that are to eliminate red herrings and extra junk wherever possible, to be mindful of how players are able to take in information, and really to lean on the world building. Understanding that, I think, is respecting the player. We also avoid putting in text unless it's absolutely vital, because again, they really will not absorb it they will process it as quickly as they can for puzzle elements, and then it gets thrown to the side. So it's a really poor way to deliver any kind of story. Since this is part of the narrative summit, I'm not going to get too deep into how we go into the world building, but this is like a summary. There's a huge difference between what the player actually sees and processes and what we need to know in order to make a world that feels cohesive. Honestly, that could be like a whole day-long summit in itself. But so Spark of Resistance, it's a spy drama, but from another perspective, the players are terrorists instead of freedom fighters. We chose to set our story in an oppressive world full of censorship, and we knew what we wanted to say about that, which guided everything that we put into it. But from a player perspective, you're just kind of going on a fun adventure. So, in Spark of Resistance, that game, this is the lesson in action. Players are told that they're secret agents who have been activated to investigate the office of a spy who is deep undercover. That person had missed a check-in, and we assume the worst, like they've just disappeared. We need these players to go in and figure out what's happened. So this is how it plays out. Their first puzzle leads to a tape recorder, which says, if you're listening to this, I'm in big trouble. Then the players send a key card through a built-in message tube system. And in the game flow, that is the first time that character, which is not a real person, but that's the first time they become aware of the players in that space, in the game world. The spy then sends them back a note, which is written on another puzzle. And they use that information to distract a security guard, and it displays a video of the spy evading the guard based on the information they've just sent. The spy then speaks directly to the players via a camera, and it's a betrayal. So from that point on, the players are on their own. They have to complete the mission and save themselves. Each of the puzzles moves them forward in the task of investigating the office and helping the spy. Each one grants them slightly more knowledge about the dystopian world via an increasing amount of security clearance and access to information. And this is all done with like 2 lines of dialogue, a short video, and that handwritten message, which you can see. So for each of those moments, we boil the plot and narrative stuff down to its very most essential message, because we knew that people would not be able to process anything more than that. The environment, the object design, and the puzzle mechanics carry the burden of the rest. So our second challenge is telling an engaging story in a physical space in a cinematic way. Knowing that players are not going to take in that info, how do we turn, you can imagine the big scroll from Star Wars. How do we turn a huge wall of text into the single evocative image, which is what kicks off A New Hope? It's a tiny starship flying against a huge inky black sky, and then a massive star destroyer. You don't need or really remember that text because you know exactly what the dynamic is from the first image that you're presented with. Show, don't tell, right? In my experience, when you show up in an escape room, it's all about that sense of anticipation. You don't really know what's about to happen because you want to avoid spoilers for yourself. You probably don't know what it looks like inside because places generally don't place photographs of their rooms online. You're maybe a little excited, maybe a little bit scared. So you show up, and then the first thing that happens is that you're handed a letter, or you get a really long speech about the world and what you're supposed to be doing in it, and it's just a hype killer. So nobody remembers any of the story that is presented in those moments. But thankfully, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's best practices for moving people through physical spaces, from LARP to theater to theme parks. They've also undergone the stress tests that escape rooms as an industry have not. They're putting thousands and thousands of people through these spaces every day. So if we look to them for the best practices of how to convey story in those environments where people are moving through them quickly, we can really learn a lot. And I also have to call out environmental storytelling is like a legitimate meme at this point, joking about the way that video games place little vignettes into levels to tell you, whatever has just happened, but something has happened here. But the reason it's a joke is because it's so obvious, right? Like, ideally, you're using the level layout and the affordances of all of the objects and interactions, but being obvious in this manner stops the progression of the plot while you look at it. And in an escape room where there's a ticking timer, that's a huge problem because you're deliberately wasting the player's time. So the lesson's there. Use elements from architecture, LARP, theater, films to set the tone and the design for specific emotion, and avoid and eliminate frictions that yank people out of immersion. Like when you think of what an office looks like to you, it's probably like this top photo. It's messy, there's fluorescent lights. You can see that reflected in media like Office Space or The Office. But when you start looking at more stylized versions of offices in film, also set in sort of dystopian era stuff, you can see where our influences were taken from. So our third challenge, to use puzzles and interactions thoughtfully, to make the game fun and reinforce the themes. And I have to step back and talk about why we actually like puzzles, because actually maybe we kind of don't. People solve puzzles because they like pain, they like being released from pain, and they like most of all that they find within themselves the power to release themselves from their own pain. I love that quote, but escape rooms are like a kind of funny niche right now, and I think people self-select out of them a lot because they feel like it's going to be difficult. But these are behaviors that we see in the real world all the time, whether that's from video game grinding and farming. Like those are terrible terms. That's not fun as we would define it, but all the way up to marathoning and rock climbing. That's the type 4 kinds of fun, where it's not necessarily fun while you're doing it, but you're kind of glad you did it. What makes a good puzzle tells you how to solve it, inherent in its design. You don't have to have any kind of explanation. You also don't need to rely upon outside knowledge like literature or film trivia. And a good puzzle is also adjustable by adding or reducing the information in it. Like this puzzle is obvious what to do in this, and this guy is really enjoying doing the obvious thing. So the way to implement that is through the use of diegetic objects, eliminating busy work, only including puzzles that are going to propel the plot forward, and elimination of friction, and we'll discuss friction in a minute. This is an example from Spark of how these principles were put into action. Players were presented with a shelf of library books. If you are familiar with how a library works, you can guess that the stickers on the side refer to the Dewey Decimal System of cataloging, and putting them into order forms a sentence that directs you toward a page inside one of the books, where you find a library checkout card that you overlay onto a page. It's a really solid design because you can solve the entire thing without any other elements. If you know how the books work, it's easy to do. But actually, the player base is now aging out of using libraries, so it's maybe not a great puzzle anymore because it does require extra outside knowledge, like typewriters, VCRs, and cassette tapes are the same. So everything I've described is about crafting an illusion for people. They have the illusion of agency, and they have this feeling that they're propelling themselves through a very carefully crafted puzzle path. But actually, nothing that they do is accidental. Every single thing that they maybe we would consider like emergent play is something that we have planned for. Because we've very carefully avoided creating friction in the design, people are totally immersed and everything is flowing easily. They have no idea how much work has gone into making that experience fun because they have been totally transported and are able to live in that moment. And I think that's something really special. I think that the greatest sin is promising to deliver that gift of transportation, for an hour or however long you're engaging with the work, and then doing something that causes reality to come screeching back in. Like if you think about the pattern recognition with the face in the sink, like it's natural human instinct to want to peek behind the curtain. So that's something that players look for without even thinking, and it's our job as entertainers to keep that curtain drawn. Friction can come from a lot of places, and mostly it tends to do with accessibility in escape room games. Lots and lots of puzzles rely on color changes, for example, but that totally eliminates the experience of anybody who's colorblind or in any way sight limited. Considering accessibility of motion, of hearing, and of movement is also a big one. So, experiences in games are a gift that designers can give to our players. We've done a good job if we can help those players enter the magic circle and have fun in the worlds that we've built. But if we can help them to not only experience the world in a new way, to feel a bit of magic transportation and heroism, and then carry that new way of experience in the world with them when they leave, that is success to me. So, thank you. We can take questions, I guess, at the mic. We have 10 minutes, yeah. Hi.
I was wondering if you have any best practices for developing narratives that adapt to different players' skill levels. Like with the escape room, right? It could be like a room full of 12-year-olds or a room full of 32-year-olds.
Sure. So the question is about adapting the game dynamically for the level of the skill of the players in it, and that comes down to hinting, generally. Hinting is a very specific skill, because you want to point people in the right direction, but it's like having somebody scratch an itch for you. Like, it just doesn't work. They need to be able to scratch it themselves. So it's just about providing enough information to set them on the right path. But also generally, like, 12-year-olds are sort of in a gray area for being able to enjoy most escape rooms. They don't tend to have the level of concentration necessary. So that's part of that, is just only allowing a certain age group to participate in the first place. So.
I wanted to talk about time limits and escape rooms in virtual reality. I'm working on a virtual reality escape room game right now, and having played other competing games in that space, I actually personally feel like time limits don't make sense in that capacity, because it's inherently extremely unfun to play through again. Failure doesn't feel good. And because there aren't real people or a real space that you need to kick people out of, that doesn't serve the player outside of creating that stress, which may be worthwhile in and of itself. So I kind of wanted your opinion on that.
Sure. So in the games that we do, actually, this is kind of a secret, but I would be absolutely happy if 100% of players got out. There were 3 minutes left on the clock, and they also felt like they were the only players to ever escape. But that's crafting that illusion. It's an entertainment component, right? I think that in VR in particular, you have to watch out for the physical fatigue. So having a timer in that situation might just be a way to make sure that people aren't experiencing time dilation and forgetting that time is passing. But you're right. Like, it could just be a totally untimed thing, as long as there's enough structure to lead people through it.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Hi. Wonderful talk. Is there a resource for other disciplines? We're all here to feed the narrative. I'm an audio person, so it's part of my responsibility to support the narrative. Is there a resource to learn better communication, whether it's a book or online, to learn more about the vocabulary?
Yeah. So No Proscenium is an amazing website and newsletter that it's listing physical experiences generally. And they have a corresponding group on Facebook called Everything Immersive. And it really is for everything immersive. And I would recommend starting there. We actually have started an immersive book club, which we're running. If you look at immersivebook.club. So that's one of our ways of attempting to, like, break out of the silo. Because, yeah, there's, like, best practices for UX, and there's best practices for theater, and then they don't ever really cross over. So that's something that I think is really important just as an industry, and it's a new industry. So
Cool. Thank you.
thanks.
You've made a lot of escape rooms. Do you have advice for people who are new to that? How much work does it take, and how do you start small so that you don't boil the ocean?
To make escape rooms?
Yeah.
Oh, man.
In 30 seconds or less.
Sure. So first of all, I would say escape rooms ultimately are a ticket-selling business. The fun part of doing the design is over very quickly. And there's a lot of real estate stuff involved in them, so I would keep that in mind before sort of venturing down that path. But if you're really determined, playtesting is by far the most important thing. And there is a skill that you have to develop in watching people try and fail to solve puzzles, because if they're failing at it, it's your fault as the designer and not really their fault as a player. So learning to be able to see that, to hold yourself back from intervening and doing that, is really the best lesson. And I'd say playtest like 3 to 5 times more than you're doing the design. So,
I think he was next.
sure.
Wonderful talk. You spoke about world building, and we authors love to world build, and players never get it. But sometimes players they will see this bits of lore and story, and they'll just gloss over them, and this can bore them or disengage them, and they in turn will disengage other players, and it's like a negative feedback loop. How do you best determine like a dose of world building or story lore for players to avoid this?
I mean, I think it depends on the type of player you're creating the lore for, right? Because like I'm somebody who wants to dig really deep into all of the secrets of something, so like I will read all of the material that a lot of people probably are just moving past. So like if you're designing that thing for me, having it there and then making it easy to pass by totally makes sense. But if it's something that's meant to benefit all of the players, I mean, I would start asking like what is actually necessary. If it is something that the players are deciding is not important to the experience, then it might either be conveyed better in some other manner or just taken out.
Okay, thank you so much.
So, thanks.
I know it's, in a sense, almost the opposite of what you do, but I'm particularly interested in meditative spaces, and I could also see how it's very similar in certain ways. I wondered if you had any thoughts about engaging design for meditative spaces. I mean, do you remember the game Myst?
Yes,
I
I
used
wouldn't
to
be
peel
standing
off-
here if it wasn't for Mist.
Oh, wow, okay. I used to peel off on the side of that little island and just hang out with the dappled sun coming in, and finally the game would just say, are you going to do anything? You know, not.
Yeah. So I would actually say, like, the sort of opposite coin of the work that I make is untimed, like, experience-based stuff. The Now Play This thing that I highlighted at the beginning is situated in a desk, and it's supposed to be the experience of reading other people's letters. And I consider that a game. And it's something that you participate in, you feel everything, you're looking at it, you're reading between the lines, but you personally decide when that experience ends, when you have enough information or when you're satisfied. It's something that Her Story used really well, I think, as well. So there's definitely a place for it. But yeah, for me, the opposite of the escape rooms is stuff that's entirely reading and is untimed and is like deeply personal and not team-based. So yeah, there's
Thank you.
definitely space for meditation.
Just in your talk, I'm excited to see more of your work.
Thanks.
Hi. Do you have any insights on how to make people not feel left out in some part of the games? I always feel like that in escape room games.
Every single player, even on successful teams, says something like that. They say, oh, I didn't do anything. And like when you're watching through the cameras, you're like, no, I saw when you picked up that thing and you made this connection. The way to do that, I think, is through a sort of debrief afterward, which is something that LARPs really nail. It's something where you walk players through and then you specifically call out, like, you did this, and you ask somebody, you know, what did you do that with this thing? There's also a thing from LARP called froth, which is a collective myth-making that occurs when you're sort of, when the players are telling the story, so they're sort of world-building after the fact. So just making room to encourage that, I think, would be really helpful with that feeling. But everybody feels that way, too, so, yeah.
Yeah, that ties very much into my question, because I usually have a similar feeling after doing a room escape game, and I feel like, man, I'd really enjoy doing this with like one or maybe two other people instead of like 5, 6, 7, 8, and we're all just like looking at different corners and shouting at each other like, did anyone find that combination yet? And like, oh, you solved that? I didn't even see that part of the puzzle. So
Yeah.
I'm just curious how you think about the numbers of people participating, or how to design for puzzles solved by groups where you don't necessarily get to see the whole picture, like sit down with the letter and put the narrative together in your head quietly in your own time.
So that's kind of where the cinematic moment stuff comes in. We usually try to have people branching off into different areas and spaces, but when there's some sort of story thing that we need them to see, we drive them together. That's something that you see in theater like Sleep No More, for example. For the big major scenes, all of the actors all converge physically on the same space and something plays out. So you can choose to not participate in that, but you're also like missing a huge part of it. It's just very tightly structured in that way to make sure that there is always something for people to do. I'd say the sweet spot is generally 8 people as well for an hour-long game. So,
Thank you.
sure.
You had mentioned wanting escape rooms to be taken as seriously as theater, and I'm trying to figure out the intersections between theater and gaming. And one of the things that even something like Sleep No More doesn't have that games have is a fail state, which escape rooms have. And so I was just wondering your thoughts as something that I've been trying to figure out myself of like, how do you make a fail state still narratively satisfying?
For our games, we try and get everybody to at least a particular part in the story, which I'd say is about at the 80% mark. So they've seen everything there is to see. In Spark of Resistance, that's where the turn happens. Like they've been betrayed, and they're tasked with setting off an EMP device. So whether they set that off or not is sort of beside the point. They've already absorbed everything. And it is really a lot of work to get players to that point if they're sort of not enjoying the rest of the game. But I would say check out Strange Bird Immersive. They're based in Houston, Texas, and they do a seance theater experience that's sort of built around an escape room. So it's a literal integration of theater into a game.
Great.
So I think whether or not you succeed in that game sort of doesn't matter to the story that's on either end of it as well. So that is a potential structure to look at.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Hi, thank you for coming here. I'm creating my own mixed reality game in immersive theater, so I feel your talk is super helpful. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the strategies for how do we balance the player's free will and the limitation our game rule set. Because usually if a player wants to do things the game designer doesn't intend to, that will ruin or create distractions for the experience.
I mean, that's part of what the playtesting is that we do. I would say in our rooms, players never do anything that we do not want them to do, even if they believe that they are secretly. Because at a certain point, doing what they want to do in a physical room means they're going to get hurt. It's probably different for mixed reality, I'm sure. But I would say instead of trying to prevent them to do that, to build space for that to happen. Sort of a side note, I took a trip to play escape rooms for a full week in Malaysia, and the address for that is up here. It's every game in this city. And in one of the games, it was set in a classroom, and we were each given name tags for each of the students. And so the first group in our cluster that went through it, like role played as these characters that they were just making up. Then they created roles for the next group to take on with secret rules that we weren't allowed to communicate to the other players. So like that emergent behavior that we came up with made that game something really, really special. So I think just like creating the opportunity for that and then not stepping on people when it's starting to happen as long as they're safe is probably a good way to approach it.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi. So I'm a narrative designer. I'm currently working on a couple of historical ARG projects that are creating a story and a narrative game around real-world artifacts. And I'm wondering if you have any advice for creating this sort of narrative space when the boundary between what is part of the game and what isn't is not as clear as a room.
For alternate reality game stuff, I think probably players are going to read 10 to 20 times more into it than you've intended. Which is kind of nice as the designer to like not have to do that work. So I would just say again, it comes down to playtesting. Like you're always going to be surprised by what is emerging from that. But if you practice enough in advance, and I know that's really difficult for ARGs and live events in particular. But the more that you can anticipate, the better it's going to be on the other side. But also maybe don't worry about it too much because they will come up with all sorts of like fun facts and connections. Then I would work those into the game in a way that feels rewarding as if you had been doing it on purpose the whole time.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, thank you for the great talk.
Oh, sorry. We have to wrap it up, but I'm going to go to the lounge over there. If you two want to follow me over, we can keep chatting. Cool, thanks.